Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the people that are here in the room, and also welcome to the people that are joining us via Zoom. I don't see them on the screen now, but I know they are here. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to this DILEMA lecture with Dr. Sven Nyholm on the topic of human-robot interaction. My name is Bérénice Boutin, and I'm the project leader of the DILEMA project that is carried out at the Serre Institute in The Hague here. DILEMA stands for Designing International Law and Ethics into Military AI, while the acronym also obviously captures that our topic of research includes many ethical and legal dilemmas. The DILEMA project analyzes how to address the challenges raised by AI technology, specifically in the military context. We focus on three main questions. First, why fundamentally some form of human control or intervention over military technology must be guaranteed. Second, where precisely the role of human agents must be maintained, in particular to ensure legal compliance and accountability. And third, how to technically ensure that military technologies are designed and deployed within ethical and legal boundaries. Our research team is multidisciplinary, as we believe the questions we ask can only be answered through a dialogue amongst academic disciplines. And specifically, our three main disciplines are international law, philosophy, and computer science. I invite you to visit our website, acer.nl/dilemma, to read more about the project. And for those of you in the room, you will find a bunch of free copies of recent publications at your disposal right outside the room. Now, again, I'm very glad to welcome you all, either in person or online, to this DILEMA lecture. I will now hand over the floor to my colleague, Dr. Sadjad Soltanzadeh, who will be moderating the event. Dr. Soltanzadeh is a researcher in ethics and philosophy of technology with the DILEMA project. His current research focuses on the legal, philosophical, and moral importance of human autonomy and human agency in the context of autonomous systems, as well as on dynamic ontologies for AI systems. He recently published a book on metaphysics of technology, and that book also discusses the complex interrelationship between technologies and humans. Thank you all again for joining today, and we hope that you will enjoy the lecture.
Thank you, Bérénice. Welcome, everyone, also on my behalf. So for today's lecture, we are very honored to have with us Dr. Sven Nyholm. He will discuss today the topic of the ethics of human-robot interactions and the traditional moral theories. Sven is an associate professor at the University of Utrecht. His research covers a wide range of topics in ethics, including well-being and meaning in life, philosophy of love and sex, agency and moral responsibility, the concept of the self, and the ethics of human-robot interaction. Dr. Nyholm is also a member of the Ethics Advisory Board of the Human Brain Project and an associate editor of the Journal of Science and Engineering Ethics. Sven has published multiple books and papers in applied ethics, robots and artificial intelligence, practical philosophy, and ethics of technology. Dr. Nyholm will speak for about 30 to 45 minutes, and after that we'll have questions and answers both here and with people who are online. I want to thank you again for joining, and with this I would like to hand over the floor to Sven to talk about ethics of human-robot interactions.
Well, thanks a lot for the invitation to come here today and for the introduction. Yeah, that's me. Yeah, so the ethics of human-robot interaction and traditional moral theories. There are many different ways in which we can think about the interaction between humans and robots, many different kinds of ideals. And so to kind of get us up and running, I thought I would just briefly mention first one vision that's recently popped up. Actually, August of 2021, there was the Tesla, they have this yearly AI day, as they call it, and Elon Musk gave a presentation where he presented what he called the Tesla bot. And so he said that actually the self-driving cars that Tesla has been developing are really, he said, semi-conscious robots on wheels. That was quote. And he said that Tesla is really the world's largest robotics company. And so therefore it makes sense to give these robots a humanoid form. Hence the idea for this Tesla bot. And so, there he is dreaming about the Tesla bot. He explained some of the ideas he had about the mechanics in the robot and also about the AI. And actually 1 year later, there was a prototype presented. It was maybe a little bit less impressive than what one might have hoped, but nevertheless, it actually managed to walk across the stage without falling over. So that actually in robotics, that's impressive because that's hard to do. It's easier to build, a computer that can play chess or Go, etc. But to make it perform human-like actions in space and time, so to speak, is quite hard. But what's more interesting from the point of view of what I will be talking about today is what Musk said the year before when he introduced the idea behind this robot. And so, I mean, why do we need it? And what kind of problems might there be? And how would you solve those problems? Well, we need it, he thought, because, this is an old idea. The robots can take over boring work from us human beings. And we don't have to worry that we would lose control of the robots or anything like that, because the robots would be built to be friendly towards us humans. What does that mean? They would do what we want them to do. They would not have a will of their own, so to speak, no interests of their own, except for helping us with the work that we would like them to do. Also, if you're scared of like a human-sized robot, you don't have to be, said Musk, because they're going to be strong enough that they can do work for us, but they're going to be weak enough that we could easily win in a fight. This is what he said. And also they're going to be, they can walk around, but they're going to be slow enough that you could easily run away if you get scared. So this is one vision of interaction between humans and robots. The robots would be human-like to some extent, but they would be there to serve us. This robot has no personality, no face, so it's a human-like tool for us and that we can sort of treat in any way we want. Now, one interesting thing about this particular example was that the word robot was introduced about 100 years before that in 1920 in a play where actually the idea of a robot was very similar to what Elon Musk was talking about in August of 2021. Sort of a human-shaped metallic entity that would work for us, here too, work in a factory, and that would be there to serve human beings. Now, in that play, the robots, they want to know how to make more robots so that they can sort of have their own robot children, if you will, and they want their freedom. And so there's also the question of, can we really control these robots? That was already there in that play by Karel Čapek, the Czech playwright, 100 years ago. And then we see a similar kind of discussion in Elon Musk's presentation of the Tesla bot. So I think that when you think about these different kinds of visions of what a robot is or should be, then you get at least two related questions that are interesting to compare and to think about. On the one hand, how should the robots be made to behave around us human beings? But on the other hand, you can also ask, how should we behave ourselves around the robots? Could there ever be any forms of treatment of the robots that might be inappropriate in any way, or should we always just treat them as sort of mere tools at our disposal? So Sadjad was mentioning that I had written a couple of books, and so one of them is about exactly these kinds of questions. So if anyone is interested, you could check out this book, Humans and Robots, which is about these two questions in what I'm calling the ethics of human-robot interaction. Now, I was inspired by the fact that in psychology, there's something called the psychology of human-robot interaction. So such psychologists, they study how people react to robots. And quite often, people react to robots as if they are kind of not just a mere tool. Like we attribute motivations to robots. We see a robot do something and we say it wanted to fix the problem and it believed that that's what was the way to do it, etc. So people have a sort of a psychological tendency to respond in an anthropomorphizing way to robots. And so I thought this should be, I mean, I was not the only person who thinks this, but I join those who think that there should be a sort of corresponding ethics of human-robot interaction. Okay, so we have these different kinds of reactions to robots, but should we, and in what way should the robots be designed to maybe sometimes bring out such reactions, but also sometimes designed so as to not, prompt these kinds of reactions in us human beings. And I'll get back to the kinds of psychological reactions we have to robots in a second, but let me first maybe say something. I mean, I already talked about the term robots, and I said that that term was introduced 100 years ago, or actually, I guess 102 years ago, 1920, in a play that premiered in January 1921, but the play was written in 1920. And I mean, there had been ideas about things that seemed robot-like in the past. I mean, even Aristotle and some other ancient Greeks talked about moving statues, and Aristotle has one passage where he fantasizes that the statues could work for us. And so already that seems to be something a little bit similar to our idea of a robot. But when you press people who work on robots to say, what exactly is a robot? A lot of them say, well, there's such a wide variety of different kinds of things that we call robots. From machines building cars in factories to this kind of the Tesla bot that Elon Musk imagines, that maybe it's best to not have any particular definition and just look at different examples. So I'm going to look at some examples in just a moment, but let me just say something about the difference between the word robot and the word, or the term, artificial intelligence. So while robot came from science fiction, actually the term artificial intelligence came from science, as a lot of you may know, from a research proposal from the 50s. But as I'll get back to later, both ideas are sort of, at least in the way we think about them, both experts and lay people sort of mix between science fiction and science. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because quite often science fiction can give us interesting ideas. But as I will stress a few times, we should try to sometimes stop ourselves from getting too carried away. Okay, now I said it's hard to define what a robot is. And so in a certain sense, it's sometimes better to give examples. And well, one of the things you can do is you can talk about a kind of a spectrum of different kinds of robots. So the Tesla bot and also the robots in that play by Carol Chapek are what I would call a kind of paradigmatic robot. It's a sort of a human-like metallic shape that sort of moves doing the kind of the robot movements that we associate with robots. Now, most robots in real life are not like that. They are usually, as I said, it's quite hard to build a robot that can actually move in a nice way and do tasks if it has a human-like shape. So a lot of robots that work in factories and things like that, and I'll show some pictures in just a moment, they have other types of shapes that are relevant to the kind of task that they have. On the very other extreme, you have robots that are not just paradigmatic robots, but are trying to look maximally human-like. I mean, the robots are maybe not trying to look maximally human-like, but the people who build them try to make them look maximally human-like. And again, I will show some pictures of that as well. So, but let's stick first with the idea of the kind of the paradigmatic robot. As if you think about a robot, what's the first thing that comes up in your mind? Maybe something like this. I mean, this is the robot Pepper that maybe you've seen before. A vaguely human-like thing that still looks very robotic. I mean, no one would mistake it for a human, but that is performing some kind of human-like task. This particular Pepper robot is performing some sort of Japanese ritual of some sort. Already there you might see that, well, should a robot be doing that? Isn't that a particularly human task? And maybe we shouldn't hand over certain kinds of tasks such as this to a robot. I live in Eindhoven here in the Netherlands, and we have a technical university there in Eindhoven, and this is a robot that was built there, and here the robot meets the Queen of the Netherlands. And when the Queen visited the university on that occasion, I mean, most students didn't get to meet the Queen, but this robot Amigo did. And Amigo asked the Queen, "What's your name?" She responded dutifully, "Maxima." And he or it presented Maxima with some flowers that the Queen happily accepted. So, I mean, the Queen responded very much like as if the robot was a kind of person. And that's what I mentioned before with these kind of natural reactions we have to human-like behavior in robots. As I said, though, most robots that are useful will tend to look, I mean, not exactly like this, but this is one example of a robot that is used as a military robot. As you can see, it neither looks like a paradigmatic robot nor like a human being. Here's another robot. This one is working in a logistics warehouse, helping to move boxes around. I mean, it looks like, I don't know, a beetle or something like that, a hockey puck, because that's a shape that's useful for it in that particular context. I think of something like a self-driving car as a robot as well. Again, it's a machine that performs tasks that sort of works for us human beings. And again, I mean, I guess you could put a face on it and a couple of arms and legs or something like that, but it's totally unnecessary. One more example from the Technical University in Eindhoven, just because they have interesting robots there. So these are some soccer playing robots. They don't look like humans. They don't even look like a paradigmatic robots out of science fiction. However, if you see them on the football field, and the picture gives evidence of this. I mean, you see them as playing football, and people get involved. They sit and watch, they clap, and they cheer them on, just as you would with human soccer players. So again, it doesn't have to be that the robot looks human in order for us to see it as doing something human-like. However, there are also robots that are made to look like humans. So people have maybe seen Sophia the robot before. This is the one that is on the very left there, who's famous, among other things, infamous in some circles for having gotten honorary citizenship in Saudi Arabia. The one in the middle is vaguely human-like. That's a therapy robot for children with autism called Casper. And then we have, well, one of the two is the Japanese robotics researcher Hiroshi Ishiguro, and the other of the two is the robotic copy of himself that he made. I mean, that's an example of a robot that's made to look maximally human-like. I mean, this one is made to look like a particular person. When you talk about humanoid robots, one kind of robot that occurs to a lot of people is the sex robot. We have on the right, we have actually a Dutch sex robot. So we're here in the Netherlands, and that is one that's called Robin. And I think the robot also speaks a little bit of Dutch. So now, a lot of I mean, in the way that Alexa or Siri speaks, you know, the different languages that they speak. Most sex robots are made to resemble human women, but there are also ones such as Henry here, who are made to look like human men. Now, once you get to these kinds of examples, I mean, this is a prototype. Someone is actually working on creating this robot. You quickly get to the sort of the science fiction topic, as I mentioned, and you can easily get carried away. And actually, a lot of you journalists who write about sex robots in particular, and I myself have written a few academic articles about that. And if you do that, journalists, they tend to call you a lot because this is a topic that journalists find very interesting. And the questions they ask are much more questions that you would ask about robots from science fiction than real world robots. Okay, just the occasional reminder that it's easy to get carried away. Now we talk about two topics. How should robots be made or programmed or designed to behave around humans? But also, could there be ethical questions about how we should behave around them? Is it possible to mistreat a robot? That is a question that may seem very silly, but actually a lot of people, when they saw this video, this is not a video, this is a picture from a video from Boston Dynamics, a robotics company. So this is a robot that's called Spot, and it's very good at walking without falling over. So earlier in the video, you see Spot walking up some stairs. You see Spot on a treadmill. And then to really show that Spot is really good at keeping its balance, there's also an engineer that's kicking Spot. And indeed, the robot doesn't fall over, or at least not easily. A lot of people, however, who saw this video, they lost their composure. They felt that, wow, there's something wrong about kicking Spot. People posted comments online such as, poor spot. Kicking a dog, even a robot dog, is wrong. Don't do it. Same company also had this robot that is also very good at not falling over. This guy is hitting the robot with a stick, again, not to be cruel, but to show how stable the robot is. And there too, a lot of people reacted by saying like, that seems somehow unethical, immoral. And for me, what is interesting about that is that these robots can sort of trigger moral intuitions or ethical judgments in people. Like depending on how we treat them, there will be some people who feel that there's something ethically problematic about this treatment. So when philosophers, well, and others, but especially when philosophers talk about this, they tend to make use of a distinction between what they call, and these of course are technical terms, moral agents and moral patients. So a moral agent is someone who can act or fail to act morally, and this is someone who has certain duties, who maybe could have certain moral virtues, and who in their treatment of others, could be other people, could be animals, perhaps even the treatment robots, could have moral dilemmas that they're facing where they have to make decisions about what to do. And if they are able to make decisions based on ethical principles or values, then they are what philosophers call moral agents, moral decision makers. On the other hand, there are the moral patients, and those are the ones that maybe the moral agents can treat well or fail to treat well. So if you are a moral patient, so Sadjad is one moral patient, I can treat them well, and I try to, or I can fail to treat him well and commit injustices or wrong him in different ways, which I shouldn't, because he's a moral patient, someone who to whom you can have certain duties, to whom you can owe certain things. So one question then is, okay, so we think of other humans as both moral agents and patients. They can act ethically, and we can also act more or less ethically towards them. Animals are often seen not as moral agents. A lot of people think of them as not being able to make moral decisions, or at least not human-like ones. However, we can act better or worse towards them, so they are moral patients. This is an example that shows that, and the same could be said about babies, human babies. And so being a moral agent or being a moral patient, these two things don't necessarily go together, although we tend to think of most fellow human beings as being both moral agents and patients. They can both act ethically, they're moral agents, and we can act or fail to act ethically towards them, they are moral patients. So one interesting question then is, well, what about robots? Could they be moral agents and patients? Well, strictly speaking, you have at least four possibilities when you think about the combinations here. So you could have the idea that robots could be both moral agents and moral patients. On the very other extreme, you would have the idea that they could be neither moral agents nor moral patients. They couldn't make moral decisions, and we couldn't act in ways that are more or less ethical in relation to them. Or you can have these two kind of middle options. Perhaps they could be moral agents, but not moral patients. They could maybe make moral decisions, but we couldn't possibly treat them in an immoral way. Or, and this is a slightly stranger view, perhaps it's possible to treat them in a morally better or worse way, so that they're moral patients, but they're not moral agents. Now you might think, does anyone defend any of these views? And actually, yes, there are lots of people writing about this topic out there. David Gunkel, down in the corner, he thinks that it's sort of inevitable that robots will enter into the moral universe, if you will. They will become both moral decision makers and moral patients. And he has written a book that I would recommend. It's called Robot Rights. And so it's sort of asking the question whether there could ever be situations in which we think that would make sense to give rights to robots. Now, Joanna Bryson, who we also see here, she has an interesting view. She thinks that robots could be both moral agents and patients. It's quite possible. We can build robots that are decision makers that can make ethical decisions. We could, she thinks, in the future, build robots that could maybe have some sort of feelings or consciousness? And if so, then they would become moral patients. But we shouldn't build either moral agents or moral patients in the form of robots. We should let humans be the only moral agents or patients. Luciano Floridi, professor in Oxford, he thinks that, yeah, we can have robots in the role of moral agents. They can make moral decisions, but because they don't have any feelings, they can't be harmed by our behavior towards them, they have no consciousness, etc. They can't be moral patients. And this is actually a somewhat common view. A lot of people think that, and I'll get back to some examples later, that, I mean, robots, again, I'm using it in a fairly broad sense, technologies that are put in positions where they have to make the kinds of choices that humans sometimes make, where they have to perform the kind of tasks that humans sometimes make, will be put in positions where they have to make ethical decisions. And a lot of people think that it's possible to build such robots. But a lot of people are also like Florida. They think that such robots would not be moral patients. John Danaher, in some different papers, have defended a view that seemed to amount to the idea that robots could be moral patients. We could treat them more or less well, but they can't be moral agents. They cannot be responsible for their actions, and so therefore they can't be moral agents. That's one condition that people sometimes have. But he thinks that if they behave or look human-like, then they can be moral patients. So that, as I said, that's a somewhat unusual point of view. And then people like Carissa Valise, she thinks robots can be neither patients or agents because they don't have any consciousness. Okay, so this is just to illustrate that if you go out and you look in the philosophical literature about these things, there is quite the range of positions that you might have. And so one thing you could do, and here we get back to the title of this talk, when you think about this topic, you could consult traditional moral philosophy, the sorts of things that like people like me and Sadjad, when we study philosophy, we learn about when we are taking our introduction to philosophy courses. These are theories. And for the non-philosophers out there, I don't know if you've heard about utilitarianism, for example, the theory that we should maximize happiness and minimize suffering in the world. Another traditional moral theory is a Kantian ethical theory developed by Immanuel Kant, the idea that we should treat other people with respect. We should try to adopt rules of action that we would be willing to lay down as universal laws for everyone. It's a kind of sort of updated version of the golden rule, basically. And then there are theories such as so-called virtue ethical theories. These are theories that say that morality is ultimately about developing certain character traits, trying to become virtuous by being just, compassionate, brave, moderate in our actions, wise, etc., etc. So these are the kinds of traditional theories that philosophers have been developing. Really, I mean, I'm sure that they were already being developed before the ancient Greeks wrote about them, but that's the sort of the beginning, at least in the Western tradition, of sort of written philosophizing about this. And so the types of theories that I'm calling traditional moral theories, some of them are newer. So for example, utilitarianism, although there had already been proto-utilitarian theories much earlier than John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham wrote about this in the 19th century, that's when that particular theory was really kind of put in its modern form. Kant, I mentioned just a moment ago, he wrote his things in the late 18th century. Actually Bentham started writing some of his utilitarian philosophy also in the late 18th century, whereas Aristotle and Plato, etc., developed their virtue ethical traditional theories. I think it was about 300 or 400 years before the BC. So these are old theories, and the question is, I mean, again, as I said, when philosophers and others study ethics, we typically learn about these theories. And so now that we have ethical questions about robots interacting with humans, the question is, could we use those old theories and to sort of solve the problems that we're facing? And one problem is already coming up implicitly in what I just said. I mean, these theories, they were developed long ago. And even though maybe the modern version of utilitarianism is only a couple of 100 years old, still it's long enough ago that there were no robots, there was no AI or anything like that. So there's no guarantee that these ideas that developed before and that philosophers have refined for many, many years are naturally going to carry over to this new situation where we have robots with AI that seem to be potentially be some sort of new moral decision-making agents and perhaps also moral patients of some sort. So that's one worry that you might have. But to test this idea, whether we could use traditional moral theory when we think about human-robot interaction, it's a good idea to look at a few topics that tend to come up in traditional moral theory. And three such topics are the idea of having obligations to do certain things, or duties, or owing it to certain people to do certain things. I already mentioned the idea of virtue a few times, having good character traits, being the kind of person that you would like a good person to be. And third, different theories from traditional ethical theorizing about how we can treat other people well. Those kinds of ideas have been refined and developed quite a bit over the history of moral philosophy. And so, again, it's fascinating to think about whether they could be used in relation to robots. So let's start with the idea of obligations. I already mentioned before that there are situations that robots, including self-driving cars, are put into where we think that they face a kind of moral dilemma. Now, so this is a stylized version of this general idea. So this comes from the Moral Machine project at MIT. I mean, in real life, there have been accidents with self-driving cars, have faced situations where there seemed to be a better decision that they could have made than they did. And then, there have been deadly results for human beings. Here, we have a kind of cartoon version. If the self-driving car continues straight, it will crash into 5 people. Perhaps there's something wrong with the brakes. Perhaps, there are lots of cars coming behind, so it just can't stop. If the self-driving car goes the other way, it will crash into 1 person. So this is based on something that philosophers have been discussed under the label of the trolley problem before. We can get into that later, but it's basically, what should we do in this kind of situations where we either have to kill that person or kill these people, and then normally you would think that we should just try to minimize overall harm, but there's a kind of a history philosophizing about this that goes back at least to the 60s, where people have come up with cases where it seems that actually the intuitively right thing to do seems to not save the greater number. But let's put that aside and just focus on the idea that sometimes, at least according to people who discuss this kind of example, self-driving cars and other robots are going to have to make more ethical decisions. And an ethical decision here might just be something like, you have choices, at least, to A and B, let's say, and if you choose option A, then maybe a few people are going to be harmed or be treated unfairly or something like that. If you choose option B, perhaps different people would be harmed, or perhaps different people would be treated unfairly. So what should the AI robot do, so to speak? Now, that's one context in which people talk about robots making ethical decisions. Another is the military context. So different kinds. I already showed you a picture of a military robot before, but here's another set of pictures. There's a drone. Here's sort of the Spot the robot dog again, but here in the role of a military robot instead of being kicked. And here we have some sort of, I guess it's also another drone. And so those are also examples where people talk about, well, if you put these robots in sort of warfare and they have to decide, whether or not to, maybe they operate autonomously, at least in some situations, and then maybe they have to quickly decide whether or not to, take out an enemy or something like that. Or maybe they have to identify some human being, is this an enemy or is this a civilian or what? And then they have to act accordingly. So there are some people, such as the philosopher Ron Arkin, who argues that actually perhaps robots could make better ethical decisions in warfare than humans can, because we are very emotional and we can get overwhelmed and behave very badly in wartime situations. So perhaps we should have robots fighting our wars for us, because they are not going to be overwhelmed by the emotional kind of problems that we have as humans. Now, one question you can ask, when robots and AI technologies have to make these kinds of moral decisions, would they have obligations or duties to act in certain ways? And it would seem like if a human has these kinds of choices, you might think that it's your obligation to, for example, not kill a civilian in a wartime situation, or perhaps you think that if you were the driver and you couldn't brake, then perhaps you think that you should sacrifice the smaller number of people in order to save the bigger amount of people. If you think that, you might think that that's an obligation, something that you should do, that is your duty. Now, does this make sense in the case of robots, again, like self-driving cars or military drones, whatever it might be? Well, at least when it comes to some traditional ideas about what obligation really amounts to from traditional moral philosophy, then you will see that this idea may not carry over very naturally into the context of robots or AI systems making decisions. So here we have John Stuart Mill, and with his wife and collaborator, Harriet Taylor, there in the picture. And this is a very, very well-known definition of what it means to have an ethical duty that a lot of philosophers philosophizing about this can sort of agree with. And so Mill writes, and I'm going to paraphrase here, but it's not to read the whole thing, so that when we think that something is your duty, for example, if you think that saving the smaller number, the greater number, perhaps sacrificing the smaller number, if that is an ethical duty, and you don't do that choice, then others would be justified perhaps actually punishing you, or at the very least blaming you, and you would it would be right for you to feel guilt or shame, discomfort about what you've done. It would be appropriate and right if you had that kind of reaction, and others would be justified, if not punishing you, then at the very least blaming you. Now, so in the case of humans, because it makes sense to sometimes, that we can feel guilty, we have moral emotions, it can make sense to blame us. It can sometimes make sense to punish us. But what about robots? Well, you might think that a robot cannot experience feelings such as guilt or shame. Can't really punish a robot. I mean, I guess you can put a robot in jail, but or turn it off or whatever, but it doesn't. I mean, the punishment would be quite different than human punishment. And blaming a robot, sure, I mean, a lot of people would hit their computer or something like that where it doesn't work properly. But is that similar to blaming a human being? So at the very least, if you think about blame and duty and obligation in this way, that's, as I said, is quite popular among philosophers, then it does seem that if a robot can be a decision maker, it would be a strange kind of decision maker, an ethical decision maker, without obligations to make certain choices rather than others, because it couldn't live up to this criteria of being someone who could feel guilty about making the wrong choice, who might make sense to blame if they did make the wrong choice, or who might even make sense to punish. So the idea of obligation, at least according to this way of thinking about it, doesn't seem to carry over very naturally to robots. Now, I mentioned virtues also. This is one of those ideas that goes back to the ancient Greeks, as I said, and here we have one ancient Greek, Aristotle. He thinks of virtues as a kind of disposition or habit that you have that is supposed to interact with other habits and dispositions that you have, so that you act, well, in the phrase that is often used, in the right way for the right reasons on the right occasions. It's supposed to be kind of golden middle, as he puts it, between extremes. The brave person is not foolhardy, but it's also not a coward. They find that sweet spot in between doing too much and too little, and they do it at the right time for the right reasons. There are other theories about virtue. David Hume, for example, thinks that virtue is a personality characteristic that is either useful to you or to other people, or that's agreeable for you to have for yourself, or that's agreeable for other people that you have it. So, I mean, if someone has a sense of humor, for example, then that can be, that might be nice for them because that makes them laugh, and other people might enjoy, talking with them. It can also be useful. Sometimes it can get you out of, a difficult situation by, breaking the ice or whatever. So it's an example of what Hume would think of as a virtue, as some a quality that you might have that's useful and that's pleasant for both you or others. Now, what about a robot? I mean, they can be entertaining, and so in that sense, they could have a kind of minimal virtue. They could be useful. So on the Hume way of thinking about, and so Hume is the guy in the middle for the non-philosophers here. On that way of thinking, yeah, maybe it makes sense to think that robots can have virtues. But if you think about it in the more demanding way that Aristotle did, as a kind of habit or disposition that's supposed to interact with other habits and dispositions you have to make you act in the right way for the right reasons on the right occasion, then I mean, you would have to have a really advanced form of AI in order to achieve that. Most technologies are really good at one type of task in a controlled environment, whereas this ideal of virtue is supposed to be the idea of a kind of a certain fluency, so that the virtuous person can enter into one sort of situation and because of their virtue manage to do the right thing. Now they're put in another situation, again, because of their habits and dispositions, they would do the right thing. I mean, for us humans, it's very hard to be virtuous. It's even harder for robots with limited forms of AI. Okay, so the last thing I want to mention in terms of ideas from traditional ethical theories, these different theories, they have ideas about how we can treat other people well. Actually, virtue ethics claims that the main moral patient is always us ourselves. By being virtuous, we actually make our own lives better. Kant and Kantian ethics says that when we're being morally good, we both give ourselves reasons to be proud of ourselves and have self-respect. And more importantly for Kant, we should also treat other people with respect. Why is that? Because they have a free will and we should respect other people's free will. So being a moral patient, according to Kant, requires that one has a will of one's own, that others people can respect, and that by acting ethically, we can also give ourselves reasons for self-respect. The utilitarian theory says, if you are an animal or a human being that can suffer or that can be happy, then you are a moral patient. So the virtue ethical theory requires for it to be possible to treat you well, that you are someone whose life could go well. The Kantian theory says that you have to be someone with a will and who can be an object of respect. And the utilitarian theory says that you have to be someone with feelings or sensibility. Now, do robots have lives that can go more or less well? Do they have a free will of their own that we can fail to respect or that we can respect? Do they have feelings and sensibilities? Well, probably not when it comes to contemporary robots. Again, in science fiction, yeah, we think of robots as having all of these things, but not realistic, real robots. So these theories just don't seem to apply to robots in the way that they apply to humans and some animals. So based on this, there are really two different conclusions that you could draw. One would just be that actually we should forget about the idea of robots as moral agents and moral patients. And we should think that when humans interact with robots, the real moral agents and patients are always different humans. So maybe the robot is a kind of link between two or more humans, but the humans are the real moral agents and patients. That's one way of thinking. And if you do that, then you can use these ideas from traditional moral theory, and they're going to make a lot of sense. However, if you think that actually they can be the robots, that is, some sort of moral agents and patients, then you might need to come up with new theories. The old ethical theories are not gonna, the ones that we learn about when we take intro to philosophy, they're just not gonna work in this kind of new context. And if we develop new theories, which we might need to do, because sometimes there are technological and societal developments and you need new concepts and theories, then, well, maybe then we can have this idea of robots in the role of perhaps both agents and patients in the moral domain. I mentioned David Gunkel before. He thinks that we need to think in these ways, and we need to think otherwise, as he puts it, when it comes to humans and robots and their interaction. A lot of people who read his work say it's like I do. I think it's great, but they respond, doesn't this take us way too far back into science fiction? Well, there are people who disagree about that. You may have seen this story that was from June of this year, 2022. Blake Lemoine, the Google engineer who thought that the AI system, Lambda, the large language model for dialogue applications, I think it stands for, had become a sentient person. I mean, if he's right, Blake Lemoine, and the AI system has become a sentient person with a will and feelings, well, then you can actually use the traditional moral theories again, because they talk about, how should we treat people with a free will? How should we treat people with sensibility? That would be extremely different than the idea we started from, the robot as a kind of almost like a slave that has no will, has no feelings, and is there to work for us. So it's very interesting to compare Elon Musk and Blake Lemoine and how they think about robots. And I would say that well, I happen to think that he's probably wrong, that probably Lambda isn't sentient, but if he were right, then yes, we could, then traditional moral theory would kick in and give us reasons to think about this in a certain way. All right, so I started with Elon Musk and his dreaming here about the Tesla bot, and I think I've gone on for a little bit too long, I think, given the timing. So thanks a lot, and let's talk about it.
Thank you. Thanks again, Sven, for the very insightful presentation. Now we have time for Q&A. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. And if I can ask people in the other room to also put the online people on the, oh yeah. So that if you could also raise your virtual hands if you have any questions, and then we can go from the.
I see an organic hand being raised and back and another here. So
yes, please. Yeah, yeah. You go first. Yeah. That's the right. You go.
There seems to be an underlying assumption in a lot of this, which is the anthropomorphism that the intelligence guiding the robot has to be held within the robot itself.
So if the intelligence is just operating the robot as an extension, like the way I operate my phone to go as an extension into the digital space, and intelligence operating the robot, if it were advanced enough, could operate it to go into the physical space, then the considerations could potentially change dramatically in terms of ethics if it's not contained within the body that's being perceived.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, with robots, because you have a physical entity there, people tend to project all sorts of capabilities onto the robot and have all sorts of reactions to it. But with other forms of AI systems, it might be a computer program, and there's the computer on which you're running the program, but it doesn't have that sense that there's a being there. And like I said, I mean, when psychologists study human-robot interaction, they really find a lot of evidence that people do tend to have these anthropomorphizing reactions. Now, what you also said was that we can maybe think of, maybe both robots and computer programs and AI as a sort of extension of ourselves. And I mean, I sort of agree with you that ideally that's how we should think about them. And then we can see ourselves as maybe getting new capabilities when we develop these technologies, that we extend our own capabilities. Ideally, we should think of these technologies in this way. However, we do face the problem that people at the same time tend to have this kind of emotional reaction whereby they make the separation between themselves and the technologies. And so we sort of have to deal with the fact that, and it's not just lay people. When experts talk about self-driving cars, for example, they also tend to say the self-driving car decided to do this, decided to do that. It knew that it had to go left or right. And so it's very hard to not have these anthropomorphizing impulses. And so, yeah, we sort of have to deal with that. But if we could, I would agree with your suggestion that we should think of more as an extension of ourselves. But a problem is that it's very hard to do so, both for lay people and for experts.
Thank you.
Thanks. You also the question. Could you also use the microphone and make sure you turn it on because they're not on? Thanks.
Is it on now? Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sven. I was wondering whether there could be other moral reasons that would be sufficient for granting robots some kind of moral agency or patiency. So reasons such as the fact that they occupy a very special role or position in our societies in a way that impact human lives and non-human lives as well is sort of a sufficient reason, even if reasons like the ability to make moral decisions or have certain dispositions are not there.
Yeah, so actually, I mentioned David Gunkel. That's the view that he supports. He thinks that we should look at the types of relations that we can have with robots, the roles that they can play in our lives. I mean, he sometimes makes an analogy with, you know, when a wild animal is sort of introduced into a household and becomes either, you know, a pet or maybe becomes a farm animal, then suddenly we have a completely new relationship with that animal, and it gets a name, it gets, you know, a kind of moral status that it maybe didn't have before. And why couldn't the same thing happen with robots, says David Gunkel. And also, well, actually, as I mentioned a couple of times, I mean, people do tend to treat them in anthropomorphizing ways. Now, that would be a way of thinking where it's not really the capabilities of the machine or entity itself that matters, but rather the ones that we project onto it, or the way that we interact with it. I mean, I am partly sympathetic to this idea, and I think also perhaps in addition to that, you can also think in terms of the symbolism. So like when the person is shown hitting the robot with the stick, and the robot has a sort of vaguely human-like form, or when the other person is shown kicking the robot that reminds people of a dog, that could be seen as expressing a kind of attitude of it's okay to hit or kick human-like things, maybe sending a message that we shouldn't be totally opposed to violence or something like that. And yeah, I mean, I think if one is a hardcore pacifist, one might think that, okay, we shouldn't send out those kind of messages. And then there would be a symbolism that's the problem, rather than you're not really harming the robot or the robot dog. It's rather that you might be harming other people. You might feel that you are, I don't know, glamorizing violence or something like that. So that would be another way of thinking, that doesn't really matter what the robots can and cannot do. It's maybe what they symbolize that matters, or how we relate to them. I mean, it would be in line with the second of the two possible conclusions I talked about, because a lot of the traditional ethical theories don't talk so much about symbolism, and they don't talk so much about relationality. They talk more about, you know, does this entity have free will? Does it have consciousness? Does it have pleasures and pains? Can it be virtuous? And so yeah, I mean, you might think that you need these other things, and that's fine. But I mean, it's not to say that no traditional philosophy has been at all about symbolism or about relationality, but at least sort of the ones that we learn about when we take the intro to philosophy courses don't talk so much about that.
Yes.
So adding to the point of anthropomorphizing robots, isn't the real question we need to answer in the end what makes a human? Because that's exactly where like these traditional moral theories start to kick in. And this is where we intuitively, are not very clear, because like most people wouldn't ordinarily argue something looks like a human, therefore it is a human. So like, I was just wondering if maybe you would be able to give a short overview of like where the academic debate is at that point.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, I highlighted three types of ethical theories: utilitarian theories, virtue ethical theories, and Kantian ethical theories. And they all indeed have a kind of view of what's essentially human. So the utilitarian would say it's essentially human to have the capacity for pleasure and pain, whereas the Kantian tradition says, well, no, well, we have a capacity for pleasure and pain, but what is essentially human is the fact that we have a free will and we can make ethical decisions, whereas the virtue ethical tradition says that we are beings that can perfect ourselves, that you know, by developing certain habits and dispositions can be again, more fully human, so to speak. And so those are three quite different ideas of what it is to be distinctively human. I mean, you look at the history, not just, I mean, philosophy, but all different religions, etc. They, you know, sometimes the idea is that we have a soul, that's the, or it could be that looking like a human is seen as being the most distinctively human thing. I guess I think that when it comes to saying whether a robot is more or less human-like, there are at least two simple tests that you can perform. One is to look at it and see, does it look at all like anything that you would call a human? That's one dimension. I mean, and some of the robots I showed, like the one that's a copy of this Japanese robotics researchers, I mean, it actually looks exactly like him. So it certainly looks human-like, but it could be that that robot's behavior has nothing in common with a human being's behavior. I mean, in that particular case, it happens to be the case that it also behaves a little bit like, you know, him, Hiroshi Shiguro. But this would be a second easy test to see if something is human-like. Does it behave in any way that we would associate with human behavior? And of course, you could have a robot that both looks and behaves in a very human-like way without having a free will, without having pleasure and pain, without being able to perfect itself. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you that it matters a lot what we mean by being human-like. And I think this is one of those things that sort of every age, every time has its own like theories, usually having to do with the latest scientific developments. When people started thinking about mechanisms and, you know, the human being became a machine, people start talking about computers. Suddenly the brain is a form of computer, etc. So I think this is something that evolves over time. And I mean, you asked for an overview. I mean, it would take quite long, and it's a really great question. But yeah, you're right. One important point is that from the point of view of the topic of my talk today is that the different traditional moral theories, they did all have their own distinctive theories about what is distinctively human, and quite often their ideas about what duties we have, what it is to treat someone well would go together with those views about what it is to be a human being. And quite often that would be things that humans can do, that they can feel pleasure and pain, but that robots can't do. So that's why they have this problem that if we want to use the traditional moral theories when we talk about robots, then we either have to somehow extend them, or we have to add new ideas, because those ideas developed at a time where people thought about humans and not robots, and therefore there might be a kind of mismatch between the theories and the new moral agents and patients that people are talking about.
Thank you. I have a question. So you mentioned the traditional moral theories, the three main theories as we are normally taught. I wonder if you could also give examples of some other moral theories which may sit outside these like so-called Western tradition, and whether they also have, for example, even they do have any conception of moral agents and patients in the sense that we find, for example, in deontology and utilitarianism, and what sort of human robots ethics would derive from them.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And there are colleagues, even one who I see at least was here before, Cindy Friedman, a PhD student in Utrecht. So she and others have worked on the question of whether you could take traditional African Ubuntu theories of ethics and sort of relate them to this context. That's a tradition where, again, I mean, to some extent, like virtue ethics, you have the idea of developing yourself and becoming a better person. And in that particular tradition, it is in interaction with other human beings that we become. There's this famous slogan, a person becomes a person through other persons. The idea is that we are essentially social beings, and it's really when we interact with others that we become better people. And well, Cindy Friedman, who either still is here or at least was here, she argues in one of her recent papers that, well, if you have a human-like robot, but that is really an impoverished copy of a human, so to speak, you couldn't become a person through that robot in the same way that you can become in your interaction with another human person. On the other hand, there are other people who have also discussed that same sort of theory, who argue that, well, maybe the robots could become persons through other persons, so to speak. So that's one type of theory, this traditional Ubuntu theorizing in African philosophy. The other one that comes to mind that people have been writing about lately is sort of Chinese Confucian ethical theory. Here the ideas, I mean, there are many, there's a very rich tradition, but some of the ideas is that social harmony is very important good, maintained partly by certain rituals that we perform, ideas again about how to perfect ourselves. I mean, some of these themes are not just part of Western philosophy, but are part of the other traditions as well. And so then, of course, the question becomes, all the rituals we could perform together with technologies like robots that would somehow enable us to become wise persons. I mean, that's an idea that's very important in Confucian ethics, wisdom, to develop wisdom. I mean, again, you might have the kind of worry that I mentioned that Cindy Friedman has about Ubuntu ideals and robots, that, well, maybe you can develop certain capacities when you interact with robots, but would you be able to develop the kind of wisdom that you can if you're part of a human community, you know, with all the complexity and challenges that there are there. So definitely this is a topic, as I said, and when a lot of us studied philosophy, we just learned about utilitarianism, Kantian ethics and virtue ethics. But these days, you know, I mean, definitely a lot of places, including actually in Utrecht where I work, we try to widen things out a little bit. And a lot of people interested in ethics of technology are doing this. And those are just two examples, the Ubuntu and the Confucian traditions that are being introduced. And people have different views. Some people think that those would allow robots to be a kind of persons, agents and patients. Others argue that, well, partly because they're so rudimentary in comparison to human agents and patients, they, again, maybe in the far future when science fiction comes true, so to speak, then perhaps then yes. But with the kind of technologies that we have today, those traditional ways of thinking also don't really allow for a full type of moral agency and patiency in robots.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe final question. Could you also use the microphone? Thanks.
I was wondering, because you were talking about obligations of robots, and in that, for example, about self-driving cars. And as you said, the trolley problem, oftentimes, even for humans, the obligations are not entirely clear. But then if you would assume that the robot in itself does not get the blame, but instead the AI, and so the basically developer of the robot would get the blame, has there been any discussion on how to even try to get the rules established for these robots on how to make decisions? Because then basically what the developer is putting in as, you need to choose, for example, a child over an adult person to live when the car is going. How do you lay blame? And is it even possible to then talk about obligations of robot based on what the developer puts in?
Yeah, no, I think that's also a really important question. I mean, so lots of people are thinking about this. I myself have written a little bit about it, and I've partly discussed it in the terms of the idea that was raised earlier about robots as a kind of extensions of ourselves, but I've also discussed it in terms of the idea of robots and humans as forming teams in a way, that where we are acting a little bit like supervisors or managers. So if you have something like a military robot or a self-driving car, maybe it is doing a lot of the work. I mean, it's driving us around, or it's in you know, the military robot is performing some task in the battlefield. But we could use the kinds of theories that have been developed, for example, in military ethics, about how commanders can be responsible for what people under their command are doing. And we can sort of put the robot in the role of the soldier that's being, you know, whose behavior is partly the responsibility of the commander, and think in terms of the relations within, you know, the teams where there's a supervisor or some form of manager or commander, and that way view what the robot is doing as something for which the human can be responsible. So it's some of those models that we have for human teams doing things together, especially teams that have a certain kind of hierarchy of responsibility, I think can make sense to kind of carry over to this context.
Thank you. And with that comment, it's time for us to close today's lecture. I first want you guys to please join me to thank Dr. Sven Nyholm. I also want to thank you all for coming over in this very rainy day, and also everyone who joined us online. Please feel free to stay around and have further discussion. There will be hot beverages outside for this cold weather. Thanks again, and see you next time.
Thank you.